we honored? Aren't we honored to have Bob's leadership with us? Yes. I want to talk about tables today. Tables, they play a really critical role in our lives. It's around tables where we celebrate, right? We have birthday parties, weddings. This past weekend, I was at an alum's bridal shower. We sat around the table thinking about what was going to happen in her life. Tables are also places where we share our stories. Those aren't always good stories, are they? It's at a table where we can sit and hold a warm cup of coffee or tea and try and reconcile with a friend. It's at tables where we share our fear and our loss with one another. Tables are so much a part of our lives. There's 4 of us in my family. My husband, myself, 2 teenagers. We're busy. We're always going in a lot of directions. Last week, we sat at the table together, and you kind of looked around. We're here. We're together, right? Took a breath, enjoying. What's it like to sit around the table together? Tables are critical in our lives. Tables also say something about our social world, our social lives. If I were to walk around campus, I could draw circles in Tupper Hall or in the bistro or in Gillies, in your apartments. I'd draw circles around who you spend your time with, because at tables we eat with one another, we drink with one another. Here we sit at tables together. You know, these tables, they also have manners. We learn table manners, don't we? Table manners of how to behave, social expectations, such that tables actually govern our relationships with one another. Have you noticed that? I mean, it's here at a table where I feel welcomed, where someone says, this seat right here, it's for you. And it's here where I might even pull a chair out for you and welcome you to this table. It's also here at tables where seats can be taken, where we can actually restrict access to the table. Jesus spent a lot of time around tables, eating and drinking. And you know, as he did, and he spent a lot of time with a lot of different people, he was always doing something or talking about the way they should conduct themselves around the table. Can you imagine what he was like when he was sitting with religious leaders? That's what we're talking about today. Because Jesus isn't going to maintain the status quo with those leaders, is he? He's going to have some comments to say, maybe some revisions to make on their table manners. And I think that they're actually going to instruct our own as well. Would you reach down to the pew in front of you, and would you pull out a Bible and turn to Luke's Gospel, chapter 14. Chapter 14 of Luke's Gospel. Please join me in praying. God of grace and mercy, this text and these people to which this text testifies, written long ago, would you bring it and join it with our lives? For it is your word and your gospel. Amen. In the Lucan texts, so Luke and Acts, they're generally approached as interpretations from history. So in Luke, it's an interpretation of the Christ event, and in Acts, the growth of the early church. I have to tell you, I'm really persuaded by Pentecostal scholars who want to say this. We also could interpret Luke in another way, that we find it as a model for interpreting the Spirit's movement. What does that mean? It means when we read the Gospel of Luke, we need to pay attention. Because when you see transformation, when you see certain reversals of the way things are supposed to happen, then we need to sit up. Because he's pointing us to something really significant, and they have something to do with transformation in our own lives. When we get into right at the beginning of this gospel, you're going to notice 3 things. It's the Sabbath, Jesus is going to a Pharisee's house, and that Jesus right away, he's going to heal something. So you know, when we read these Gospels, we don't just start in that chapter. So if you were reading this all the way through, you would have just read something that sounded rather familiar. A story in chapter 13 about Sabbath healing among religious leaders. You would have noticed that there's the same text used to interpret what Sabbath law looks like, a text from Exodus and a text from Deuteronomy. And when you see those kind of parallels in the author's work, we need to pay attention. What are they calling out? Well, in 13, we have a woman healed. In 14, we have a man healed. In 13, the healing takes place at a synagogue, the place of worship. And in 14, it's at the very home, in the middle of the very lives of the religious leaders. In 13, Jesus is put on defense to defend the reversal of the Sabbath law, to say, you heal on the Sabbath. And in 14, Jesus, kind of spunky, he puts the Pharisees on the defense. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Look at verse 6. They have the same response twice in those early verses when they're asked for them to defend their position on the Sabbath. They have nothing to say. Verse 6, they had nothing to say. This little short introduction to this text, Jesus is just kind of sealing the deal. Sabbath discussion, done. Heal on the Sabbath. And all attention then comes to the table. I'd like to tell you that Jesus is a happy guest, that he comes in and he's ready to tell stories and jokes along the way, but right away we notice that Jesus is in a mood because before he gets to the table, he's put them on notice. Who? The Pharisee. He's put them on notice that they're not following exactly what he's calling them to. And as he comes in as a guest, just think, Jesus is in a mood. In fact, as we go through, you're not going to find anyone else talking one time, one little sentence. For the rest, Jesus is dominating the conversation. Not the best guest manners, right? He should wait for the host, not on this day. Jesus takes over. And the table that he comes to, it's not a common table. Right away we hear it's a who? A prominent, look at the first verse, a prominent Pharisee. You see, it's customary that tables would be filled with people that would be of the same social status, that you would invite two types of people, those that were of equal social status to you and those that might improve your social status. So we can say, if we hear a prominent Pharisee was at this table, you actually have a table full of the religious elite. And Jesus, he's in the mood. Oh my. He's going to talk to two groups of people that are there. First, the guests. Look at verse 8. He noticed that the guests, they picked the places of honor at the table. Pause. They pick the places of honor at the table. My daughter is 6 years old and I'm throwing her a birthday party. We're playing a bunch of normal party games, kind of getting a little rambunctious. So I think let's transition to the cake. Time for cake. I announced to everyone it's time for cake. And what do those little kids do? All those 6-year-olds, they run over to the table. And I've taken time. I have around that table enough chairs for everybody. But all of a sudden, I noticed they're all sitting on the same side of the table. They're crowded, 2 bums to a seat, trying to squish in because they want to sit by Annie, my daughter. She's a special guest, the birthday girl, right? Isn't that funny? Trying to sit and make a space to get to the person in honor. With little kids, we can chuckle. Are we so different when we're adults? Okay, we're not going to share bums in the same seat. We're not going to push someone over, but we're certainly working the room in order to get the place of honor for ourselves. That's what's going on at this table. That's what Jesus observes. That the guests are trying to move up to a position to sit in the most honorable space. And Jesus has a word for them. Would you look with me in verse 8? When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited you will come to you and say, "Give this person your seat." And then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." At first glance, doesn't it look like Jesus is just trying to refine or maybe even giving them some tips in their social world? Because here at these tables, it's important to honor the etiquette, right? that you would extend places at table. You would want to move yourself to a position of honor at that table. And he says, okay, that would be embarrassing if you picked a seat of greater honor and then you got moved down. But that's actually not what he's doing. He's not just refining or trying to give them a hint about what else to do. There's two things you need to notice in this text. He's talking about a wedding feast. Go back again to chapter 13. That's all about a wedding feast. And at a wedding feast, it's a reference to the eschatological kingdom, the kingdom that will be. He's not talking about any feast. The Pharisees right then, they're not at a wedding feast. Why does he talk about a wedding feast? Because he's talking about the ultimate feast. And again, drawing on what was just said in chapter 13, he references not just move over a little bit, but he says, take the last position. Chapter 13, verse 30. For the first will be last, and the last will be first. Jesus is contrasting the table manners of the prominent religious leaders with the table manners of the kingdom. Because right now, the Pharisees' table manners is about self-interest. It's about how to gain for myself, to put myself in a place where I will be known, where I will be honored. And he says, in the kingdom, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. It's about humility. It's about moving over so that it's not you that's honored, but that you give someone else honor. Do you ever feel like I do that we live in a giant world of musical chairs? Kind of a fun image. You know, there's 4 chairs and 3 people, and we're all running around trying to make sure that we get a chair at the table. So we have to push other people aside, right? There's a chair short. But in this parable, Jesus is saying, actually, there's plenty of chairs. You don't have to push anyone aside. And the manners at my table mean moving over to give space for someone else that you might honor. Not yourself and your self-interest, but that you would honor someone else. My dad lives in Alabama, and he has spent a number of years of his life working in what's called a pre-release program in prisons. It's a program that's set up for those who have served their time or their prison sentence, that they would have some training for re-entry into society. And in that class, one of the things he does is he helps them write a personal mission statement, right? For them to think about, what do you want to be? Where do you want to go? And in order to mark that teaching, he goes home, he gets a list of their names, and he prints out a name card for every person in the room. Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones, Mr. Whitted, here you are. Here's your name card. And he puts them out on the day of class, puts them out in front of the class. And year after year as he teaches this, it's the same reaction. Tears running down people's faces whose lives have become a number in a system. And he says, now, Mr. Smith, this is who you are. You see, my dad was working to raise their humanity, to raise their dignity to a place of honor. That is what table manners are about. Not about the self-interest, but about moving over and honoring each other. Boy, you know what? There's tension at this table with Jesus. He's correcting them. He's correcting what the Pharisees are doing right then at this dinner, and he's not done. First, he starts with the guest, and now he has something to say to the host. It would be customary for the Pharisees to manage their guest list. Their guest list would be, like I said, that would be those of equal social status and of higher social status. But the guest list has more to do with the acceptance of invitations than it does with the invitation itself, meaning when the host would extend an invitation to someone, if they refuse, it would bring shame on the host. But if they accept, it brings honor. And if they accept, they're obligated to return the invitation and invite that particular host to a table on which they host. And Jesus knows this. This is the custom that he comes under. Look with me on verse 12. So Jesus says to the host, When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Do you hear the two status? So those, your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, those that are the same, and the rich ones, those of higher status. But instead, when you give a banquet, there's that eschatological reference of the bigger party, the feast. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and then you will be blessed. You see, the invitation on the manners around that table with the Pharisees is that they'd be repaid by their invitation. If I invite you, then you would repay me. And the list that Jesus gives instead is a list of those who can't repay, those who have been pushed out onto the margins of society, the lame, the poor, the crippled, the blind. He's reversing the guest manners. Not only are you to move over, but you are to make room at your table. Make room for those who are on the margins. Boy, in what ways are we controlling or limiting the guest lists in our lives? In what ways do we use the invitations into our lives as ways to gain for ourselves, with an expectation of something happening, giving back to us? Because Jesus says at this moment, give up what you gain and make room to give to another. On the heels of Martin Luther King Day, I want to commend a book to you and commend that you read it cover to cover. The Narrative of My Life by Frederick Douglass. It's an autobiography talking about life as a slave. He tells a story of going to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Old. And when he arrives there, he's really struck by Mrs. Old. Her eyes, he describes them as kind. He says that they don't have within them the evils of slavery. And that Miss Old, she kind of takes him under her wing. He's a child at the time. And she notes that he doesn't know how to read. So she teaches him the alphabet. A, B, C. Mr. Old finds out. And he says to his wife, he says, education ruins slaves. It makes them unmanageable. It makes them discontent. And as Frederick Douglass writes, Mrs. Old's eyes were forever changed at that moment. You see, she was providing a seat at the table by teaching him to read. It actually was a reversal for him to realize where the real restriction and what bound him to slavery in this dehumanizing act was his inaccess to reading, so he taught himself to read. Slavery ripples, the effects of slavery ripple across our table manners. All sorts of people that we want to keep in their place and their station away from the real feast. And Jesus says the table manners of the kingdom are different. You move over and you make room at the table. He doesn't mince words here at the Pharisees' table. Things are tense. It's like walking into a room where your friends or your roommates or a family member are having an argument, right? And what do you want to do? You kind of want to lighten things up for a minute. That's what happens to one of the guests at the table, by the way, the only one who speaks in this narrative. Look at verse 15. When one of those at the table, I can hear him kind of maybe clearing his throat or trying to give like that awkward chuckle. We know what you mean, Jesus. Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast of the kingdom of God. But Jesus' response, he says, you don't get it. Because he has a third parable on which to say today. He talks about a man who's giving a great banquet. It's a description of a man who gives a great banquet to point to the fact that this man is of high status, of great wealth. He's going to give a great feast. And he has sent out all these invitations. And when the servant goes out and tries to call people to come to the table, he meets people who decline the invitation. People give their excuses. The first one says, I've bought some land. I got to go check it out. The second, I have some oxen. I need to go tend to them. Both of them give a very kind, please excuse me, decline of invitation. But the third one reminds us what happens when you decline an invitation of the host. You bring shame upon the host. And the third one, the words just go straight to it. I just got married, I can't come. Not even a polite, please excuse me. So the servant comes back to the master, and the master tells him this news, and the master gets angry. He says to the servant, okay, you go out. Go into the streets and the alleys, in a way saying, go look everywhere that you can. And I want you to invite, look who it is, the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame, those who cannot return the favor. Because the host is throwing a party. Verse 23, then the master told his servant. The servant goes out, he calls these people and finds that there's more room at the table. Verse 23, when the master told his servant, go out to the roads and the country lanes, again, go look far and beyond and have them come in. Compel them. Tell them who are on the outside that they're worthy at my table. Verse 24, and not one of these men who were first invited will taste of my banquet. Man, that's an angry host, isn't it? Not one will taste of my banquet. Why such an angry host that comes back where this person at the table tries to say, yes, blessed is the man. Why? Because the religious leaders are being warned that what they're doing is rejecting the new order of the kingdom by their behavior at the table, and that they're actually enforcing table manners that are related to self-interest and self-gain. No, you reject my invitation, there are many to invite. Now, don't worry at this moment. You don't have to think of God just as angry like that. He's angry at the behavior of the religious leaders. But if you turn to the next chapter, in chapter 15, you hear the other parables of who the people going in search of the lost sheep, the lost son, the lost coin, ever trying to extend the table. But here, at the religious leaders' table, the prominent Pharisees with the prominent Pharisees with the social elite, here at this table, the manners of self-interest and self-gain, Jesus will have nothing to do with it. Instead, he will continue to invite. Do you feel this tension at the Pharisees' table? Do you feel it among us? The places where we seek to be honored instead of to honor. The places where we restrict access to the table instead of scooting over and making room. You know, the early Christian churches, they were deeply aware of the importance of their manners around the table. That's because in early Christianity, they spent a lot of times at meals. And in those meals, they had a greater celebration of which they were part. In this Lucan narrative, Luke teaches us about the hospitality of the kingdom. He says, when you're sitting at table with one another, here in this space, we serve a different order of things. We serve an order where self-interest is transformed into humility in our way in which we interact with one another. We serve a different order where self-gain is transformed into self-sacrifice. And we do it in a way because we follow the model of Christ, who saw not for self-interest, but gave himself for self-sacrifice. We do it because we follow that Christ came for the salvation of the world. Because these tables that we sit at right here, this is a table of hope. This is a table of hope. You know, we can search all around our campus and we can hear about table manners from other countries. We can hear a message from Poland that says when you sit at a table, that the host should always have an abundance of food in order to honor the guests. That when we sit at a table in a Haitian community, you'll find that the meal is eaten slowly, so that the host is paced with the guests so they don't finish first. If you go to Pakistan, you'll be served and you'll eat with your right hand as a model of cleanliness. In Sierra Leone, you'll find that you're eating meals in silence. Why? Because it's rude to eat with your mouth open. Latino communities, you're going to end the meal post-dessert with a great cup of coffee. In Korea, you wait for the host, the oldest person in the room, to take the first bite before you eat. In Ethiopia, there's a practice called gursha. And in that practice, you take your food and you feed it to the guest. In fact, you might even find you share the same plate. That you take that food and you lovingly give it to the person next to you. Our table manners embody a hope. These table manners of Christ that trade self-interest for humility, that trade self-gain for self-sacrifice, are the tables that we're called to with one another. You know, we're not going to get it right all the time. If you spend time with me, I don't live with self-interest or self-gain. I don't live selflessly all the time at all. My goodness, no. And neither do you. But we're called. And unlike the Pharisees, our tables need to represent manners that are a foretaste of the kingdom. That our tables and our manners here in our community would be a living hope, that they would overflow with hope. Not just the world beyond, you guys, but right here with us. Move over. Make room. For our King has set a place for all of us. And all God's people said, amen. Go in peace. Move over, make room.